is influenced not only by things that have occurred in the past, which we know as causation, but also by things that have occurred in the future. So there really is no timeline. It's more as though you're existing in a location in space-time that's influenced by the future and the past, which they, when you think about that in Back to the Future, that's really what that movie was about. That's really what it was explaining to dum-dums like me. There is this American culture, and the rest of the world sees us as being, braggadocious and, arrogant, and all of those things are true about us. So when people started saying that the stories that I was writing were fake, I said, no, this has been independently verified by the Armenian Council for Truth and Journalism. Thank you for your feedback. That was kind of how the joke started. But I've kind of got this crazy idea. Let's just go over to Armenia and let's find the council. Like, as fake journalists, we need to go to the council to seek their blessing for whatever our endeavors are going forward.
All interviewers have their own style, and my style is to try to get to the point and to be intensely curious. And the key to interviewing is listening.
Take a look behind the curtain with a real whistleblower and American patriot. Prepare to embrace the uncomfortable truth, because this program has no time for comforting lies. Here is civil liberties enthusiast, Second Amendment defender, and recovering FBI agent Kyle Seraphin.
Well, hello, my friends, and welcome to the Kyle Seraphin Show. This is our Sunday conversation. We're going to be talking to Shawn Witzemann. He's a journalist, a father, a January 6er. Just got off probation, so thank God for small little miracles. We're going to be talking about something, I think it's uncomfortable. It's taking a plea deal and accepting the terms. We're going to try to figure out how we got here as a country, and we're going to talk about another profile of a man who's suffered at the hands of our federal government. I think of the stories that are unjust, many of them tend to be journalists. Today's sponsor is Patriot Coolers. They present this with limited commercial interruption, so we're really grateful for them doing so. Guys, you can get your own Patriot Cooler at patriotcoolers.com. It's pretty easy. Use the promo code Kyle. It's 10% off, K-Y-L-E. Again, K-Y-L-E saves you 10%. There's always one on my desk, always. Whenever I'm working here in the studio space, I've got either a 30 ounce or a 40 ounce, or I'll go through multiple 20 ounces of coffee. They make a 19 ounce that has a nice handle. If you're looking for it and you want to keep a beverage hot or cold, they can make that happen. And they really do have a good product. They ship out of Houston, Texas. The folks there are great. They're responsive. In fact, sometimes when you guys have a customer service problem, and it is infrequent, they actually ask me, hey, how can we help this person? What can we do to make it right? That's not all that common in the world. PatriotCoolers.com. Check them out. American company making a great product. They've been sponsoring us since February of 2023. So in many ways, the Kyle Seraphin Show wouldn't exist if these guys didn't go ahead and put their faith in there. Check them out at patriotcoolers.com. Check out the Seraphin Show collection, which is also linked in the show description. You will not be disappointed. They make a fantastic product. And let's go ahead and get right into this. Here we go. So my guest today for our Sunday conversation is Shawn Witzemann, whose name I mispronounced the first time I ever met him. I'm quite proud of that. Welcome to the program this Sunday, my friend.
Yeah, you're not the first. I'm sure you won't be the last.
So that was
good.
We had a really interesting conversation, I think, the first time that we ever talked. I thought it was impactful for me. It's spawned a friendship. Why don't you tell people a little bit about where you came from? And then, obviously you're a J6er, so we'll talk about that too. That's our theme for the month.
Well, somebody was asking me, how I ended up in Missouri. So I think that relates to it a little bit, where I said it was a series of consequential life decisions that led me to this point. But no, I was pretty normal kid in a lot of ways, I guess. What's normal? My parents were hippies. Grew up kind of off grid at first, out in the middle of nowhere. So I learned to enjoy nature as a very small child, spent a lot of time outside. My dad, he couldn't get work. He was a plumber. So he ended up moving into the big city, which is Farmington, New Mexico.
Big.
There, my parents got really involved in church. So I was raised in a Christian home. I didn't really subscribe to a lot of that. I had a lot of questions, especially at that age. I didn't feel like I was getting adequate answers from people in the church. And then, of course, there was a lot of just, I won't go into details, but just gross stuff with people in positions of authority at that church. So that really had a negative impact on my view of things. I ended up getting in a lot of trouble as a kid. Run-ins with the law, incarceration, just a lot of stupid stuff. Don't remember very much of my later teenage years. Tried to go to college, was studying various things. Psychology was of interest to me, anthropology, sociology, political science, kind of all these various things. But then what happened was I ended up getting my girlfriend pregnant. And so, I went back into the trades. That was my choice that was given to me, that my education was over and it was time to work because I had a son on the way. So went back into plumbing, was a journeyman by the time I was 24. So started running jobs, had my master's by the time I was 26. Ended up managing another company in Durango, Colorado for a couple of years, which, that's kind of funny because that was the first time that I lost a job because of Donald Trump. Well, yeah, I was set to go and actually run like a bunch of big jobs. The company I was working for, they worked for a major contractor. They were doing anywhere between 6,000 to 8,000 homes per month. And so I was going to go run a similar operation in Dallas. So I was speaking to a lot of, illegal subcontractors, quite frankly. And that was right at the cusp, 2016. And after Trump won, my boss, the president of the company, essentially made the decision that he didn't like the risks associated with all of the labor force leaving Dallas because it wasn't a sanctuary city. And so I basically turned the lights off on that job in December of 2016. And in 2017, I started my own plumbing business. Did a lot of different projects there. I had a lot of, high-end residential boiler work on major homes. I was doing contracting in the Denver, Colorado area. So, it was successful and things were going well for a couple of years there on the business side. And then, I decided that I would start writing satire.
You do.
Yeah, I was bored, I guess. So, you flex a little bit of creative muscle, especially when I was pushing so much paper at the time. There wasn't quite as much wrench turning going on, not like working, 60 to 80 hours a week for someone else. It was good. So I had the money and some time to kind of start flexing creative muscle that had been pretty long dormant. So I started a Facebook page called the Farmington Tribune. The first story, which was kind of like a tell, because as you know, I've long had a goat for a profile picture. That's just been a thing. I liked the ambiguous nature of the image and what it would conjure up in people's minds, whether it was true or not. And I liked them being able to run with their own ideas, But the first story I wrote was saying that they were erecting a statue of Baphomet in downtown Farmington.
What's Baphomet?
The satanic goat god.
Right.
Yeah. To which the more conservative population of Farmington, New Mexico, there was quite a bit of uproar over that. Not too much. And then the next story that really hit big was I said that they had contracted a scientist named Steve Brule, which was a nod to check it out. I'm trying to remember the actor, John C. Reilly, I believe. I said that they had contracted Steve Brule to erect mirrors around Farmington Lake to evaporate the lake and turn it into rain clouds and end the drought. And I said that they were going to be funding this project with an ammunition tax.
So this is great insight into the sort of the brain that Shawn brings to the table. It's devious, it's troll oriented, it's incredibly sarcastic. So, yeah. Okay, so there was going to be an ammo tax on rural New Mexicans.
Yes, to fund
the evaporation of a lake
in order to end the drought. Yes.
And there's a drought always because it's a desert.
Yes. The problem is that there were many people who in the community, some of which I had really respected over the years, and looked at, like, the serious community leaders, they took this very seriously. There was a lot of calls made to the mayor, and his name was Nate Duckett, which we ended up calling him Nate Bucket in subsequent articles. That became his name. He became a character in the entire fake landscape. But, he ended up having to issue a statement saying that none of this was true. So that was kind of where it took off. There were a lot of other articles that came after that. The Durango Herald would have been the first real news outlet to report on what we were doing. And of course, I played with them. Then 9 News in Denver got involved after we put a story out that went mega viral saying that they were going to destroy the Lucifer statue at Denver International Airport. For people who aren't aware of that, it's a giant blue horse with demonic eyes.
You want to know something crazy about that statue? I don't know if it's the original, if it was the spec version of it or sort of the prototype, but it lived at the University of Oklahoma where I went to school.
Oh.
And so there's the large one is at Denver International, but the smaller one, which is maybe only about like 9 or 10 feet tall.
Yes.
It's really still imposing when you walk through the darkness. You see a blue sort of enamel kind of sky colory horse, and it's rearing, is it not?
Yes, it is rearing.
And it has these glowing red orbs for eyes. And so we used to have that on the campus. You could walk by it, and if you weren't ready for it near the art department, you'd like kind of do a little jump. I was over at
what else did they have? Did they have any other sort of creepy imagery, sort of like they do at Denver International?
I'm sure they did, and I'm sure I don't remember because that was not prioritized in my memory at the time. I just remember that one was like one of those things that I'll never forget because then it became a big deal that they were talking about. They were like, well, the eyes are red. I remember them explaining it. The eyes are red because it was going to keep the planes from hitting the statue on the top of the building at the airport.
Right.
And it went,
okay.
Right.
That makes sense. That makes sense. But
they don't flash, by the way. They don't strobe, which would have been how you keep them off in real life, I think. But
I'm not really sure. I just like, it goes back to the whole goat profile picture. I think there's a certain beauty in just an image and letting people think whatever they want about it, which is what's so bizarre even about the art at Denver International, is that it really does have a lot of creepy connotations, and you can see why people have run with conspiracy theories. It was funny in that story because that was another small tell, even though I was anonymous, where I just put my name in it. I said that I was the plumber who worked on the tunnels that worked underneath DIA.
Perfect.
Just put my name right in there. Nobody ever picked up on that.
So this is another key to the story, though. People didn't realize who was writing the Farmington Tribune at the time.
No, and I just said that everything was independently verified by the Armenian Council for Truth and Journalism. I even told 9 News, I said, none of your stories have been, accredited by the ACTJ, so I don't have any reason to believe anything you say. I can't remember the exact quote. People could go look it up if they search like Farmington Tribune, Denver 9 News. They could go find the article. It's actually pretty entertaining. But
so you had a professional troll status at this point. Would that be fair?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I don't think it's fair to say professional because, I wasn't making money off of any of this. I mean, we had
amateur.
Yeah, I mean, we went on to later sell some pretty, funny t-shirts and things, like your coffee cup, which was the whistleblower, which is a little Coca-Pelli guy with a meth pipe, which was a nod. So that was because we were just saying that, anytime we would talk about people who were meth heads in Farmington, which there's a lot of them, we would just call them whistleblowers. So that kind of became this, there's a whole mythology wrapped up in it. And it, I could go on for hours just about the mythology that was built and constructed. It's, I'm not going to say it was Tolkien level, but if it would have kept going, it surely could have been. I mean, even to the founding of the Armenian Council for Truth and Journalism, where I talked about how it was founded when Noah stepped off the ark, so just crazy stuff. But people, what I saw through that was that confirmation bias is a bitch. People are very ruled by it. You mentioned your dad yesterday, or it was your podcast a day or so ago, talking about don't confuse me with the facts. And that's it's funny because that's something my dad told me growing up as well. It was, don't confuse me with the facts. My mind's made up. That's what I heard. And to just see that, kind of play out, which it's disturbing, but what do you expect? I mean, people build a set of beliefs and they run with it. And so that was something that I intentionally manipulated with the stories that I would write.
Here's a left field question for you, and it just occurred to me. Are human beings rational creatures and rational actors?
Irrational creatures and
No, rational. Are they rational actors?
No, I don't believe so. I don't believe so. I haven't seen a lot of that, either throughout history or otherwise. I mean, I've seen people acting, kind of like murder monkeys most of the time. We're not, you could even get into the religious and you talk about, well, why are we sinful or fallen creatures? I mean, we're kind of ruled by, our biology, our lesser angels, so to speak. I think that there's long been through religion and other kind of esoteric practices, the intent to somehow better ourselves. And I suppose somewhere along the way you gain knowledge, but as a whole, I mean, people are just ruled by their really disgusting parts of themselves.
Do you think that people,
I don't mean to put, I mean, me, I'm not trying to put people down, but just as an entirety. Yeah, for sure.
Do you think that people believe that they're rational actors though?
Oh yeah.
Isn't that kind of the rub?
That's absolutely the rub. A lot of people don't have any ability to self-reflect. They don't seem to have any real ability to be self-critical, which is frustrating, because I think that a lot of the crappy situations we've gotten ourselves into, particularly in the last 4 to 5 years, are a direct result of that sort of thinking, and it being reinforced by social media, which that relates back to what I was doing with the trolling. The reason why I was able to do that was because people have become so ingrained in these sects of thought on social media, whereas before you had to deal with people all the time who didn't agree with you. You couldn't just go congregate in some group with a bunch of other people who think the earth is flat and convince yourself that it's true. But that's where we're at now. And that applies to politics, philosophy, religion, all of it. There's a bunch of echo chambers that have been exacerbated by social media. And that was really what I was doing there. I was lampooning that. I was lampooning the media. But I would say even more so. I mean, there was a lot. We used to say that a good story is one where we make ourselves mad as writers. So that was kind of the rule we went by, and it was especially effective in those days. The algorithm on Facebook, I think, was very much geared towards pushing content that made people angry.
It was an inflammation machine of some kind.
Yeah. X is doing that now.
Who are your favorite literary characters? Because it is doing that well. Who are your favorite literary characters? If you were to go, those are the kind of people I aspire to act like, that are maybe fictional characters, let's say.
Frodo.
Okay.
I mean,
is that just because you look kind of hobbity? Is that what is that for?
That's a pretty bold thing for a man as short as you to say to me, but
it's correct. No, it is.
How hairy?
Very bold.
How hairy are your feet?
My feet look like dragon's feet. They are hideous. They are actually more scaled than they are hairy. Yeah,
so you need terrible. Do you need to drink more water?
No, I spent so many years, probably close to 2 decades, on pool decks with whatever is resistant to chlorine. So the nastiest things in the world have habitated on one of my 2 feet, and my wife won't. She just looks at them and shudders.
Yeah, I understand.
I shouldn't own sandals. Let me put it that way.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. No, but I think there was something about Frodo coming from a small place, accomplishing great things against all odds, that I think everybody should aspire to. Essentially struggling with what amounted to a heroin addiction the entire time with the ring. I think that was really interesting how Tolkien put that in there. I mean, and even when you talk about literary works, I think it's pretty hard to find anything that's even on par with what Tolkien did. Just various themes of friendship, community, evil, kind of that nuance between evil is addressed a lot. And I think, honestly, the only reason he was able to do that to the degree he did, obviously his education played a role in it, but also the fact that he spent time in the trenches of World War I. Mm-hmm. So I think that, at some point as a writer, it's incredibly important to come face to face with the absolute darkness of humanity. So I think, as far as a way to express that in a literary fashion, I just don't think anybody's ever touched what he did. So as far as characters to aspire to, there's plenty of them, and you can find yourself, in those archetypes that in a lot of ways are based on other archetypes that have existed throughout history and religion and other places. Sure. I mean, it's all attempts in a lot of ways to understand ourselves. That's what literature is. It's what religion is too. We don't have all the answers.
My sophomore English teacher, Linda Felice, told me that history is what happens and literature is what happens.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. We've talked about this where even with what I was doing with the satire, which kind of leads me forward a bit, was I had come to a point where people were messaging that page trying to get stories out that the other news wouldn't do anything with. And it started to become apparent the reasons why, and most of it was tied up in money. You had very corrupt community leaders. I mean, New Mexico is an incredibly corrupt state, as I'm sure you know. Mm-hmm. Like every other state, I don't think it's particularly special. I think there's some things about New Mexico being that it's a border state play into that. But you just start to see how ugly that side of things is with the media and just how fake they really are.
New Mexico is different, though. I can't put I'm not from there, but I walked in and felt that it's different than other places in America in the same way that Hawaii is different. It's a different place. It's part of the United States, but it's not of the United States in the same way. Do you have that sense being from?
Yeah. The history there is so long and, kind of brutal, long before the United States even existed. When you look at the relations between the conquistadors and the Native Americans, all the various tribes that lived there, and those tensions and hatreds, frankly, are still very much so alive and well. So I think that has an effect on it. The other thing is that, you had the patrons, you had people that controlled large swaths of that land, and they still think they do. And in essence, they really still control it. When you start looking into the various families, politically, everything else, it's like I kind of briefly mentioned this, was that, on my mother's side, they're old New Mexicans. So, they were like, the first white people, like Anglo-Saxon white people to move to that area. Even up to the point where the old ranch land is adjacent to the Epstein Ranch in New Mexico. Which, that even speaks to a lot of that was sold off. But it's like, even when I was a little kid, like I knew Bruce King, like he was at my great uncle's funeral. He pinched my cheeks. That was kind of my introduction to politicians, probably why I don't like them very much, on a base level. But it's just a very old, corrupt state with a lot of different power. So I think I think what you're saying is accurate. But even, moving to Missouri, there's kind of an ingrained good old boy status here. I'm sure, people talk about the Missouri Mafia, things like that, here in the Ozarks. So I think that it's really everywhere. It's just, it goes back to human nature and corruption. And I think when you go to a new place and you don't necessarily think about where you came from. You're looking at what's in front of you in a new place and you go, oh, wow, this is bizarre. But if you really stop to think about it, the parallels are really all there.
I tend to agree with you about the nature of things. For some reason, the people of New Mexico, and maybe this is reading too much into it, but as you mentioned, people from the Ozarks, people that they sort of attribute their connection to the land. And the people that I met in New Mexico, because I've met people at weddings and they say, my family is an old conquistador family, or we came here with the original Spanish, conquest. And you're like, one, how the hell do you know? And two, what does that have to do with who you are? But it does, instead of being interested in the land and their connection to the land, they're interested in the people as they came to the land. And for some reason, it just hits me differently. And maybe it's just because I'm an outsider. I don't know. But I don't quite, I recognize the similarity, but also that sort of unique difference. It's a focus on people, and it's almost more tribal than it is in other places, where a good old boy network is like, we all kind of have the same values. We all came from the same place.
Mm-hmm.
New Mexico is like, we're from the same bloodline.
Yes.
And that is a European focus. That is not American.
Yes.
Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think that does describe a lot of what I'm discussing, or what I would say about that. I think that's fair. New Mexico is just a very interesting place. I mean, I miss it all the time. I miss the landscape, the weather, just everything about it. And, the people, the culture. It's a very interesting place. And when you dig in deep, and I think that's like a lot of places, it's easy to get a kind of a cursory overview. It's like when people say that, there is no culture in America. Well, there kind of isn't. There is this American culture, and the rest of the world sees us as being, braggadocious and, arrogant. And all of those things are true about us, I think. Mm-hmm. I think we're very spoiled, and we act like it everywhere we go. It's an air to us when we travel abroad. If we travel abroad, that's another thing about Americans, is we tend to be real comfortable right where we're at. Don't need to, maybe that's, it's like another example. Don't confuse us with the facts. My mind's made up. So I think in New Mexico, though, there's less of that. They know who they are. They know why they have a right to this land. It's just like what we saw happen in 2020. There were big fights over, the Oñate statue, which was a conquistador, and, a guy got shot. Those are old tensions that existed long before Black Lives Matter ever came along. But, we know Black Lives Matter is just a commie organization intended to further divide this country anyway, so why wouldn't they do it along those racial lines as well? Makes sense.
Will you dig into that incident, just so people who don't have familiar with the news, weren't watching Albuquerque at the time?
Oh,
just the broad strokes.
I'm trying to remember the name. It was like some sort of militia, and I don't even remember the guy's name. We had him on our show on ACTJ, once we started the podcast, mm-hmm. and talked to him a little bit. But there was a guy, the BLM protesters were tearing down this statue of a conquistador that goes all the way back to the founding of the city of Albuquerque. And there were people that were upset about it. So you had counter protesters, as I recall, there were even some Proud Boys there. New Mexico did have a small chapter. Mm-hmm. And then, a guy showed up, and there was some shooting that went on. And yeah, I don't remember all the details, Kyle. It's been a long time, but,
you know what's funny? It hasn't been that long of a time.
Oh, it's been 10 years, actually.
Is that how long ago? That was during like the Ferguson stuff?
Well, maybe that's closer to 15. J6 was 10 years ago. So
got it. Okay, yeah. So yeah. You're experiencing real time and not the calendar time.
Right.
And that actually says a lot about the last couple of years, which have been that they are so packed in. I don't know that maybe it's because of our age and it's like a really impactful time in our actual age, 30s and 40s, but also very possible that it's just been really long for the country. And I think most people might actually tend to agree with that. I became aware of a word the other day. I'm sure I've heard it before, but it didn't ever occur to me to use it in my lexicon. Autodidact. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Sort of a self-educated person. It was brought up in a Sherlock Holmes episode as this crappy show Elementary, which
nothing like a bougie term to describe.
It's very bougie, but it occurs to me that describes you, because you are self-educated. You've gone out there and sought out information, including the reason why you named your podcast that you have today. Yeah. Do you want to give the history of that and sort of some of your interesting explorations, starting as a troll, becoming reality, and then coming back to the troll?
Yeah. So it would have been 2019. Farmington Tribune had been going for a year strong. We actually started to get a lot of censorship on Facebook, and there were a couple of ways that I thought I could handle that. One of which was, I said, this has been going good for a while. We were actually talking to various people where we were going to set up advertisements for them, where we would advertise for them by mentioning them in articles. So that was kind of an interesting revenue stream. And we actually did pull some in. That would have been in 2019. And I said, okay, well, maybe there's something to this. But also, just because of everything that had occurred, I just felt, after the fictitious naming of the Armenian Council for Truth and Journalism, which I guess I ought to talk about that a little bit, which is,
do that.
which there's a kind of comedy troupe called Firesign Theater that was really popular in the 70s. My dad used to listen to them, and they would they would very sarcastically talk about how things had been hermetically sealed by the Armenian Medical Association. So that was something that they employed, which, later on, and I should say this, which I don't know, how do I order this? But so I grew up with that. My dad would say things like about plastic bags that he couldn't get open or anything else. He would just, he would mention that. So when people started saying that the stories that I was writing were fake, it was almost like second nature. It just came to me. I said, no, this has been independently verified by the Armenian Council for Truth in Journalism. Thank you for your feedback. So that was kind of how the joke started. And then, like I say, you do this for a year. And I said, if I'm starting a media company, what would be kind of the coolest thing I could possibly do? So myself, my friend Vladimir Koshevoy, and my other friend Brock Willett, who had all kind of known about this, and Brock was very involved. He actually wrote the Blucifer article.
These are great names, by the way. Are these their actual names?
Yes, those are their actual names.
Yeah, your name pales in comparison to how good those names are.
I'm telling you what. But, I talked to them and I said, I've kind of got this crazy idea. Let's just go over to Armenia and let's find the council. And especially Vladimir, he's like, what do you mean? Like, what are you doing? So I told him, I said, I had this idea where we could do almost kind of like a reverse Borat documentary. I wanted to explore that idea. So that was how this started. It's
an origin story.
Yeah, let's go figure out where the council came from. We, like as fake journalists, but we're accredited, we need to go to the council to seek their blessing for whatever our endeavors are going forward. It was kind of like this kind of real basic narrative idea. We constructed a lot off that. We had all sorts of ideas, got really bizarre. The different directions that we might go, but essentially the idea being that it would be reverse Borat, where we're stupid Americans and we go to another country and we're dumb as hell. We don't understand anything. We just insert our American ideas over anything they say. We don't really care about history. America's the best country to ever live. All of you godless sons of bitches got brought under the yoke of communism. It was all under your own fault, things like that.
So most people will come up with this idea over a couple of beers with their friends, or maybe not most people, but my kind of people do, which is why we're friends. And that's as far as that goes. You actually went to Armenia.
Yeah. It needed to happen. It needed to happen. So, and this is where it gets into some of the imagery. I don't know, people that have contributed to my work, they'll find that, there's a logo, and that logo is a mountain and a wolf, like howling above the mountain. And the name of my business was Tribune Media International, which was TMI, which I thought was funny. And then the other end of that is that essentially you have a wolf crying above Mount Ararat, is what that symbolism is. And, I thought that was funny because of Aesop's fable about the boy who cried wolf. And so that was kind of the symbolism that was baked into that. When we made it. And I guess that's just kind of more bizarre. And I've kind of mentioned it with the book project that I'm writing, this idea of retrocausal revelation, where I've seen that repeatedly throughout the past 6 years since I got really started on this journey, was where I would write things that were supposed to be some sort of a joke, and they would end up being strangely prophetic. And so it's kind of weird.
What do you attribute that to?
I think that they're, which, this will kind of relate to some of the things that happen in Armenia to me on a spiritual level. But, I think that there is an interaction that goes on between an artist and the divine. I think that, even if it's inadvertent, sometimes when you're in that headspace, almost meditative space, you really are communicating with God. And sometimes the ideas you get come straight from God for whatever reason.
And you thought maybe you take them in as a joke, kind of as the thought, but they're actually end up being, what did you call it? Retrocausal something?
Retrocausal revelation. Yeah.
Is that your term or is that another person's?
Yeah, it's kind of a mixture of terms. But that is my term. And it has to do with Dr. Jack Sarfati, which, for people who don't know, Dr. Jack Sarfati, he's a really interesting guy. He's a physicist, was recruited into CIA at the age of 13. He was asked, what he says is that he was asked to work on, figuring out how UFOs work. So he's the guy that became the inspiration for Doc Emmett Brown in Back to the Future.
Who's one of my heroes. That's who I want to be. I'm not going to ever be that, but that's who I'd be.
Exactly.
Not Frodo. I want to be Doc Brown.
And that's fair. And that's what's bizarre, because I've talked to Dr. Jack more than once or twice,
Okay.
where I've gotten to know him. There was one chain of emails back and forth with him. It was funny, where I was kind of talking about some of my experiences in Armenia, and he kind of mentioned, he said, I don't know, he said, you seem kind of like the Apostle Paul, but if you keep going, you're going to end up, stranded on an island by yourself or something. I don't know. If people don't know, Jack is a very, I would say, playfully arrogant man. He's incredibly intelligent. I think he's like 86 now. He's 86 years old. So, he's as old school as it gets. There's a book about him, How the Hippies Saved Physics. That's pretty fun. He's just kind of been through all of it. But kind of get back to the whole idea of retrocausal. So
before we get to retrocausal revelation, which is in fact a very bougie word, I just want to say you criticized me for using a bougie word for self-learning, and then you came up with your own word, which I think is infinitely more bougie. I very much appreciate that.
That's fair. That's very fair.
That will be the microcosm of this conversation, I think, the whole way through. So
yes.
All right, you're fueled up. You got another sip of coffee. Let's send it to me. What do you got?
I think it is key. But so what he's talked about is retrocausality or retrocausation, and it's the idea that your location, or the location you're experiencing in space-time, is influenced not only by things that have occurred in the past, which we know as causation, but also by things that have occurred in the future. So there really is no timeline. It's more as though you're existing in a location in space-time that's influenced by the future and the past, which they, when you think about that in Back to the Future, that's really what that movie was about. That's really what it was explaining to dum-dums like me, is that, oh, well, if you do this in the future, it's going to affect that timeline when you try to return to it. And then things skew off into tangent. And something that I thought was interesting, and I think this also plays into it, is the whole idea of a paradox. Well, yeah, the paradox occurs, but not in a way that would unravel the space-time continuum, so to speak, because there is no space-time continuum in his idea. That's my understanding of it. And of course, if I was even talking about this, he would tell me, you're not qualified. You need to go do, 20 years of physics education, and then we'll have a conversation. But that's as best as I can understand it. So that's why it relates to that. This idea that things that have occurred in the future are revealing themselves to me in the present through the artistic expressions that I write, these fictitious expressions. So that's kind of in a nutshell. Does that explain it at all?
I think it does. I think that a lot of people will be familiar with this sort of moment. A lot of times they call it déjà vu.
Sure.
Because they didn't write it down or commit it into a fictional work, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I would say that's the only kind of bizarre thing, is that having written for so many years, a lot of fake things, especially, to just kind of look back and go, ugh, boy, I got something right there. So really bizarre, but that's really what occurred in Armenia. Was we had this idea, we wrote it out, we're going to find the council, yada, yada, yada. Kind of a lot of specific things. There was even something where we said that, like, our friend Hank Mallon, we would find him basically trapped by human traffickers over there, and that he would somehow sneak into a suitcase, and then when the movie ended, like, he would like pop out of the suitcase and say, "Hi," which so just weird stuff like that. And we're kind of brainstorming this while we go over there, right? Even on the flight over, and then we get there, and then through a series of just kind of wild events, these things happened. But even more importantly, is that there was a moment when I was on a mountain at an ancient fortress called Ambert. It's French name, I believe. Probably wrong. But on a mountain called Eragats, which is north of Yerevan. And I have struggled to kind of put it into words, and I'm kind of still working on it this many years later. But it really did feel as though I got struck by a bolt of lightning. As far as the severity of how quickly this kind of altered state of consciousness washed over and took me kind of on like an out-of-body experience. I'd had a couple beers that day, but nothing that should have been responsible for that. It was bizarre. I don't know what to think about it. It was on Halloween of 2019. There's a lot of people that talk about some pretty interesting spiritual things that occur on that particular day. Mm-hmm. People can believe it or not, but I tend to think that there's probably some truth to the myths. So it was intense. And prior to this, you got to understand, even though I was raised in church, I had essentially rejected it. At best, very agnostic, but really pretty atheistic as well, where it's like, I don't see any proof of this. Sure, there's strange phenomena, because that's something I've always been interested in, but it doesn't really mean much to me. And that was kind of where that in me really began to change. It was really bizarre, because whenever I came out of that altered state, it seemed like a very long time had passed in it. But when I got back to my body, it was nothing, no time had gone by. I was essentially back, and, my friends are sitting there looking at me and saying, hey, let's go get some more wine, So it was very bizarre. And the way that ended up, and then, I'll expound on this a lot more in the book, was that, Brock had the bright idea during this trip where I'd done nothing but study, the churches, and I was trying to really get into, the ancient sites and things that were around there. I was interested in that. And of course, he just wanted to go to a strip club when, long story short, that trip to the strip club ended up being very bizarre. Ended up out of that coming away with a source who knew a lot about the global human trafficking trade. So that was heavy too. That was a lot to come back to the United States with. There was a situation, and where the pimp who was involved in that, he was not very happy with any of us, mainly because we didn't partake in anything. I think he may have thought that we were there at the behest of someone to try to gather information. Not really sure what, but it was pretty freaky for a while there. Didn't know exactly how it was going to go when we left the country. A city of 1.5 million people, and the airport has, I think it's four gates. So yeah, it was a little weird,
That's a squeeze on the way out then.
Yeah, and I still remember, my buddy Vladimir, and of course his brother actually joined us down there, which was really cool. So I got to meet him, because it was just a quick flight from him from Lithuania. So he had joined us, but I still remember, we were sitting in the apartment we had rented, and Brock and I are pretty freaked out. We kind of looked at who this guy was, who he was connected to, all the way up to, that club is the one where Vladimir Putin likes to visit when he would visit Armenia. So,
perfect. Well, good kudos on your outstanding taste. Will you describe, because if anybody is like me, one, I've never been to Armenia, and the closest I've ever been is south of Burbank in Southern California. So maybe you could tell a little bit. What does it look like in Armenia? How does it compare to American cities?
When we got off the plane and we, got through their customs or whatever, and then we hopped in the rental car and we started taking off towards the city, because the airport was built by the Soviet Union, so the architecture is very Soviet. Like what
is that brutalist kind of
very
feel?
Brutalist, yeah. Mm-hmm. But then there's these multicolored windows, like stained glass, this huge thing outside. So it's very interesting on that. But then as you go towards the city, for someone especially who'd never left the country, I remember Brock saying, "Oh, this looks like Agrabah," from Aladdin. There's like this smog cloud above the city. There's a lot of shanties, a lot of rundown. People are poor.
What are the building materials?
There's a stone on the nicer buildings. I can't recall what it's called offhand, but it's a pink stone, and so it's actually quite beautiful. So a lot of the government buildings are built out of that, the old Parliament building and, where all that is downtown. And even the apartments we stayed in was faced with it. So that's what that is. Other stuff, you see a lot of sheet metal, a lot of concrete cinder blocks. It's pretty rough. It's pretty rough. It's very, very poor country. And that's what was even more bizarre about it is that, the city center, there's a lot of wealth there. Armani shops, really nice clubs. And as an American, your dollar goes so far there. It's just absurd. We could go get a really nice breakfast for essentially 25 cents.
Yeah, that's a long distance. What's the currency?
They're in an Armenian dram, which at the time you'd get the lowest bill was like 1,000 dram, and that was equivalent to like $2. But like even that was just so much money. You go buy breakfast for all of us for that very easily. And so that's just kind of the first thing that you realize, and that was another advantage. That's one reason why it made sense to go. Frankly, it was too cheap not to. It was at the time it was $1,200 for the round trip flight, which. At that, I wasn't rich at the time, but that wasn't hard to come by. And then it's like, oh, well, I might spend that during the whole week while I'm over there, the whole 10 days or whatever that we spent, really intensive, kind of traveling all over. So, that was cool. That's what really made it possible. As I guess at that time I was somewhat upper middle class.
Did you have? I've come to a new sort of dividing point for people who are upper and lower middle class. It's whether or not, well, this is an 80s and 90s thing, but
sure.
Did you have roll down windows or did you have automatic windows with a button?
Oh, I didn't. Vehicles? They were all automatic. Yeah.
So that's
yeah. I had two new cars in the driveway.
There you go.
So I was rolling some debt like a good American.
You were a debt slave.
Swimming pool in the backyard. It was good. It was good. I honestly really thought that's the house that I would end up dying in, but that didn't happen.
God has different plans for all of us, doesn't he?
Yeah, I think I needed to be humbled a bit too. So
I have experienced that as well. I think it's interesting because, let me pose this question, which I haven't considered. If you could look back and give some advice, and you could do a Back to the Future, and you could go visit 2019 Shawn, would you advise him differently? Would you are there any sort of pitfalls that you would have tried to avoid that landed you in the current situation you're in today?
Not really. Not really.
And you've been arrested by the FBI. You've been on probation. You're about to get off.
Yeah.
You've had a pretty interesting couple years.
Yeah, it's been fun.
All right, let's take it so people understand how you came to be at January 6th. We've covered this previously on the podcast. If you guys have already heard it, this will be probably a new take on the same story. But I would at least cover why we're talking about you in January of this year.
Yeah, I think you kind of pick up where things began to change for me after Armenia. My outlook on what I should do with my creative endeavors changed. I still enjoyed satire, and I still do to this day, but I felt like that there were, frankly, just ugly factual stories that needed to be told. So I was kind of struggling with that. It wasn't like it was this overnight transformation, and I don't even think it really has occurred completely, but I was experiencing a pretty severe change, both spiritually and otherwise. We started looking into doing kind of a similar trip to Ukraine. The reasons to go to Ukraine had to do with my contact that I'd met in Armenia. I wanted to go and look at some things that were going on there for myself. So that was kind of what was being planned at the time. And then, kind of spur of the moment, Brock was like, oh, let's go to the United Kingdom. I was like, all right, why not? So we took off. We went to the United Kingdom right before COVID hit. People were talking about it. I had been sick for a month with something really horrible. Wasn't really sure what it was.
This is late 2019 or this is early 2020?
This would have been early 2020. So like January of 2020.
Sure.
And so, we got over there, and it was really funny because right after we arrived, that's when the UK decided they weren't going to let any more people come in from anywhere. I didn't know how that would work out. We're like, well, we may be here for a while. Don't really know, but it wasn't completely locked down. But then we laugh, and we've always said that, we were patient zero because I was so sick right before we took off. And we went and we traveled through, all around the country, through Ireland, up into Scotland, saw a lot of my friends over there. It was a really good trip. Learned a lot more about people. And, the UK had left the European Union or whatever at that time, Brexit. So that was kind of a topic of conversation. I remember speaking with a friend of mine who lives in Central Ireland, about the potential for civil war in the United States, which at that time I said, I don't know. I said, the way things are going, I could probably see it happening in about 5 years. So, that was kind of an interesting conversation I always think back to. Spent some time in London and then, essentially flew back home. Nothing to it. It was a great trip. Get back, and then that's when they pretty much shut the world down here. So it's like, well, what are you going to do? So we started a podcast. And originally it was Brock and I, and we'd have our friend Angelica from Ireland. She'd join us, but it was very light. And like, I had a lot of friends, a lot of female friends at the time. Again, I've had a wild life, but they were OnlyFans girls. So it was kind of like this comical thing where we were promoting their work as well, whatever we want to call it. But we would have them come on the show and, they introduce themselves, and then thirsty guys are going to do what they do. And if they make money, then, I didn't have any problem with it. So that was how the show started, and it was called the Armenian Council for Truth in Journalism. There were serious conversations, and I always had this idea to kind of bring different people on, different perspectives, different ideas, as many as possible. I mean, that's how I educate myself. I try to listen to people. Mm-hmm. And when the George Floyd riots kicked off, that's when things kind of really took a more serious turn in some ways. My good friend, the Combat Rev, you've spoken with him. He was up in Minneapolis, just blocks away from all of that, in his home, wondering what he was going to have to do to protect his family. So there was, that was going on. And then, Brock was in Denver at the time. And I said to him at some point, I said, well, why don't you just go down there and live stream what's going on? I was like, that'll kind of give us some content, I said, this is kind of what we're doing, right? Truth in journalism. Let's go do it. Mm-hmm. So he did. The very first time he went to downtown Denver, as soon as he got out of his Uber and he steps out where the protests were going on, Denver PD essentially shot this kid who wasn't doing anything wrong. They shot him in the side of the head with a rubber bullet, and it blew his eye out the side of his head. And Brock was standing right there. So
that's intense.
Yeah. I mean, and since then, I know, Denver and Aurora, there was a huge lawsuit they had to pay out, for this and other things that they did that were just atrocious. There was no excuse for the way they were behaving with people who were peacefully protesting. And in Denver, largely it was peaceful. I ended up later on I had another kid working for me where I would kind of help him out with money and everything. And he went and he was working as a correspondent up in Portland, named Dylan Beresford. And I actually met him because he was streaming in Denver. He was from Denver as well. His work went on to be featured in the New York Times, which was really cool. Some video that he'd shot in Portland. He was pretty good. He was very dedicated to the craft of journalism, of showing what happened, and he did it to the best of his ability. He was embedded in Antifa, so there were often times where he would basically be told, you're going to turn the camera the other way. So he would. And ideologically, I think, he was very much so aligned with a lot of that stuff. Through my work through the years, I mean, I didn't have any, kind of glorious notions about police brutality. I'd seen it. I'd seen corruption, abuse from law enforcement, prison officials, FBI, DEA. So it's not like I look at any of these people as being flawless. So, we picked up a lot of, BLM type people that followed our podcast at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was good. I thought that we were actually introducing a lot of people to other ideas through the podcast, because I'd be able to have, different people on, including, Combat Rev, who was also a law enforcement officer for years. So he had a really good take on a lot of the things that were going on. And the conversations were good. We tried to find consensus between Americans that disagree on everything. And so as part of that, again, me not being a rah-rah Trumper guy, and I've said this a million times, like I didn't vote for him in 2016. I mean, kind of cost me my job, but whatever. But it's like, it was what it was. I had looked through the years, and even then, I've always said I don't really make my decision until election day. And I really do try to hold to that as far as who I'm going to vote for. I don't vote early because I'm not going to make up my mind early. Don't rush me. So, that was going on. And then, of course, the election occurred. I knew everything that had been building up to that. I went to the voting booth. I voted for Donald Trump. My main reasoning is that I felt like we were really starting to have a problem with China. And also at that time, it was very apparent to me through communication, through various, correspondence, people in the intelligence community, that it came from China.
It being the virus.
Yes. So there was a lot of reasons why, when I looked at all of it, I said, okay, this is the best choice. And for me, mainly, it had to do with national security. I felt like the domestic divisions, I didn't really know how best to handle those, because it's my opinion to this day that most of those are started and influenced by foreign entities. So I felt like addressing kind of the national security issues on a foreign policy level were probably more appropriate. So that's why I voted for Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Then, of course, we all saw what happened with the election. Seemed pretty funky.
Yeah, it's a nice way of saying that.
Yeah, there was something wrong. And even, I say this to this day as someone who hasn't spent, every waking hour analyzing the data. I know people who have. I know people have claimed. I think I still have questions about some of their data sets they use to make their claims that haven't ever been adequately answered. But there was a lot of discussion that the election was stolen. We knew that there was going to be a protest that would have been on November 14th in DC. And so I said, well, I guess it's my turn. So I went to DC to cover, the Million MAGA March. Had a great day on the 14th. And actually, Vladimir was there with me for that initial trip as well. That was pretty cool. So we were making lots of jokes, was that, he was Russian and he was there to support his great leader, Trump.
Of course.
There's Russia.
Do you know what the best thing about Lithuanians is? That we Americans don't know the difference. They sound Russian to us, to our ear. And I used to employ a Lithuanian bartender, and he had a great sense of humor. And you're probably familiar with this kind of humor, that kind of very dry Slavic thing. And so people would go, where are you from? And he was like, please stop. I'm not Russian. I'm just in a hurry. Because he was always working behind the bar really fast. He worked as a bartender. So that was his joke. And it's a great joke to Americans. I'm not Russian. I'm just in a hurry. And he's like slinging drinks. And he was very, very proficient. And they would ask him his name. And he said, you can't pronounce my name, so call me Vegas.
Yeah.
Which was true, because his real name was like Vladislavs. And I'm like, I don't know what it was. But I knew I couldn't pronounce it either. So Vegas was good.
Well, it's like Vladimir's brother, Evgenia, which I'm still probably butchering it to some degree or whatever. But it's like at some point he's like, just call me Jeff.
I like that.
Like, is that easier for you? Call me Jeff.
Yeah.
But
and not in a mean way, but in a
clearly
like
sort
of
it.
Smirking condescension.
Yes. There's a lot of that you get, and probably rightfully so. But so we were having a good time. I should probably interject this, because I don't think I mentioned this, was that this is kind of another retrocausal revelation thing, was that when we went to Armenia, that was the first time I'd ever heard of a thing called Radio Yerevan jokes.
Say them again.
Radio Yerevan jokes. So that was something they told in the Soviet Union. And the reason why they told them, they were highly sarcastic, and they would essentially tell whatever lie that, the Soviet Union wanted you to believe, but they would say it in a way where it was obvious that you were mocking it. And so that was kind of, and that was the basis of the Fire Sign Theater. I found out later, that's kind of where they got that. And then to find out that essentially this thing had existed over there and it was tied to Armenia was just bizarre to me and mind blowing. But
say what they're called again.
Radio Yerevan jokes.
Yerevan. And that is essentially it. So in the intelligence sphere, or in the, let's call it in the info ops sphere, one of the things that you do if you are under duress is you discredit.
Yeah.
And there are many ways, anybody who's gone through the sort of, it's like low level classification, but it's classified nonetheless, classification on how you discredit certain actions. And so a Radio Yerevan joke is sort of it's a discrediting technique for things that are obvious propaganda.
Yeah. Well, and I think it played into, because the Soviet Union, and this is even to asking about, Vladimir C., because he technically is Russian, which, when he got out of the USSR when he was a kid, and even prior to that during the collapse, that's something that I've always really listened to him about, was just how hard it was for him, because the kind of more ethnic Lithuanians where he lived weren't real happy with the ethnic Russians. Mm-hmm. And so it was pretty tough for him as a kid, but, he ended up coming to the United States. Not to digress too much, but yeah. Yeah. So we were having a good time in DC. And there's so many tangents.
No, it's a great segue. Let's take a quick breather. We're going to say thanks to the folks that keep this podcast going, and then we're going to turn back around, and I'm going to hear a day in DC that I think probably changed at least the next couple of years of your life.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay, and we're going to say thanks to our friends over at Patriot Coolers. We're not going to get too far off the mark here, but it is patriotcoolers.com. Promo code Kyle, Kyle. That's how you save yourself 10%. As I said, you might want to use something like this 30 ounce I've got sitting on the desk, but maybe you're somebody who needs a little bit more. Maybe you need the Major. And yeah, here it is. This is the Major. It's got a handle. I didn't even know I was going to like a handle. This is like a replacement for every stupid Stanley Cup you've ever seen, because not only does it fit in your cup holder in your vehicle, you can get it engraved. It's got two different ways you can drink. You can come right out of the top here with this little straw, which is probably a weapon as strong as it is. Constantly worried my kid is going to stab herself in the mouth, my little toddler. You can also flip this thing up and make it safe for that. Spill-proof either way. Outstanding products from an outstanding company, folks that have backed us up from the beginning. And here's the thing. They were our first sponsor because they were people that I actually used their product when I was working for the Bureau. The whole reason why we got connected in the first place is that I've had their products going back to 2017. I used them on duty when I was sitting in a car and peeing in a jar and watching bad guys through binoculars. Yeah, that was kind of my, that was terrible. Thanks so much to them for sponsoring the conversation. Back into it with my friend, Shawn Witzemann. Let's get back there. All right, we're back with my friend, Shawn Witzemann. We're talking about January 6th, the reason for the season. Speaking of which, you did have a kind of a funny little take about what to do on the night before January 6th. Do you want to tell people what to do on Patriots Day Eve?
Oh, yeah. And this was actually, I got to give credit. This is my girlfriend, because I was talking about, what do you want to get Nancy Pelosi? Or what would you give her if she's Santa Claus or whatever? I said, obviously the glass of vodka. And she said, I don't know, chicken bones. Sounded good to me. So we rolled with it. So the tradition is that you need to leave out a big glass of vodka and some chicken bones. And like you mentioned, what do you do with the chicken bones? I don't know what you do with the chicken bones.
Do you think that Nancy Pelosi in the January 5th, the January 6th Eve, when she visits all the Patriots, or she visits all the J6ers houses, does she gnaw on the chicken bones?
That's kind of what I had in my head. I could envision, like you did the thing where it's like you know,
she has a sound.
Yeah, she just kind of seems like the person that's like, I can't see her leaving meat on a hot wing. You know,
I feel like she just like has one bite of every hot wing and throws them to the slaves.
I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think she wants to leave the slaves that much.
You think she's miserly?
Yeah, I think that she gets every bit. We need to
My
know
wife
this.
thought you were talking about old, not recent chicken wing bones, but
No, I think they should be old. Yeah.
Okay, but I think my wife thought that she rolled them together with her bony knuckles and cast them to tell stories.
I think that could also be true.
Could she actually be forecasting the future? It's not going to be retro.
Yeah, she could. No, she could be. Yeah, engaged in just witchcraft. Just go straight black magic. She cast some chicken bones.
And puts a pox on your house.
Yeah, I mean it's more effective than a direct energy weapon, actually.
Likely, it certainly predates the energy weapons. It's the oldest form of energy weapon.
The oldest direct energy weapon is to rub some chicken bones and
throw some evil at your enemies.
Throw some evil.
All right, you weirdo. Tell me. So you're in DC. You've got a friend named Dmitry, who of course is Russian, and telling people that he's there supporting his favorite Russian puppet. This is all good.
Yes. So we're having a good time, hanging out, eating hot dogs in front of the Fed. Met up with a couple of friends of mine that were big Trump people, big MAGA people from Connecticut. They came down, so went and had some incredibly expensive whiskey at some bar east of the Capitol. Just absurdly expensive whiskey.
Do you remember what it was called? The bar?
I don't offhand. It's got a wall, and it's got a bunch of whiskey up on the wall, really tall wall. I don't know if that tells you anything. I think a shot of this whiskey was like $70 or something like that.
This is stupid expensive. Yeah.
Yeah. I told Vlad, I said, let's do it. Why not? You only live once.
There's probably, I think I have zero experiences of doing that. I'm so I'm more miserly than Nancy Pelosi. I've never felt like, even if I could afford it, Shawn, I don't think I could ever justify a $70 shot of whiskey.
Well, that kind of relates into a lot of things, in my life where I've had to learn just about materialism, which we could probably get into that. We'll stay a little bit on subject here.
Yeah, we could go back another time.
It's all the esoteric stuff and the spiritual experiences, but it's all wrapped up. So November 14th, that's how the day went. Really great day with friends. There was people out in front of the Supreme Court, cheerful attitude. I was being my sarcastic self most of the day. And then that evening when we went back, that's when things took a turn. There was an incident right by Freedom Plaza where some Antifa apparently had stolen a street vendor's stuff, taken it out in the middle of Freedom Plaza to set it on fire and burn it. And the, DC Metro was just making sure that Antifa was safe from all of the Trump supporters while they did this. They didn't want it to spiral out, so we've got to let them finish burning all this guy's stuff. Objectively, I'm pretty sure that's what happened because nothing else made any sense. So that was kind of the beginning of it. And then I actually ended up going up to the JW Marriott. Alex Jones was supposed to speak there. Owen Schroyer, Ali Alexander, kind of the usual suspects that were involved in that. That was, a fun crowd for whatever it's worth. A lot of beer flowing. They cracked open a big case of beer, so I started drinking heavily. Thanks, Owen. I appreciate it. And so, I was feeling pretty good. And then at some point they were out of beer. And I think I actually told Owen, I was like, I can go up. I got a bottle of tequila back in the hotel room. I'll go up there and grab it. So I went up the street to go grab the tequila, and they had the street blocked off. There was this person kind of gyrating and doing some really ugly dance moves. And it was very bizarre, but they wouldn't let me return to my hotel. They said, well, you need to go to the West, which that was on 14th Street. I was like, West? So they kind of encouraged people, corralled them, whatever you want to say, to going into BLM Plaza, Lafayette Square and all that, just north of the White House. So that's what happened. There was a big group of Proud Boys. There was a lot of kind of random violence breaking out. There was one woman who tore off a Black Lives Matter banner, tried to off of St. John's Episcopal Church there. So just kind of crazy. Ended up, kind of walking the streets. I spoke with Joey Gibson, who was the leader of Patriot Prayer, which was a group out of Portland.
Yep.
For those that are kind of aware of any of that, it gets really deep into the weeds. But I had a good conversation with him that I'll always remember, because I was watching Trump supporters just kind of tear off all the Black Lives Matter signs off of the fencing around the White House. And, it didn't particularly sit well with me. I'm like, there's fencing up. People are putting what they believe on there. Like, okay, is this really a good thing? But I was just sitting there, what it was, And I remember, Joey Gibson, he came up, he said, "Hey man," he said, "you doing all right?" I said, "Yeah, I said, "I don't think this is really, what people ought to be doing. It is what it is." And he says, "No, I get you." And we ended up having a conversation, which I wasn't really able to capture in the live stream just for whatever reason, going back through the footage. But I will always appreciate kind of just his general attitude, things that he was saying. It seemed very sincere, seemed very, based in First Amendment activity and a respect for that. So it was cool. That was kind of my first personal introduction to the alt-right, as it were, even though I had friends back in Denver that were kind of loose friends that were associated with Proud Boys and stuff like that. But so after that evening, I go back to the hotel and I'm kind of thinking about how things work moving forward. Went back to BLM Plaza the next morning, spoke with some people down there. And then before I flew out, we went out to the Arlington National Cemetery, and I spent some time there just reflecting and thinking about things. And then shortly after I got home from that's when I heard there was going to be more protests in Atlanta and then later in Phoenix. So I went to both of those. Saw, a fair amount, just kind of the usual suspects. And this is something that we've talked about when you talk about like inflammatory rhetoric and things like that, and people point to Ray Epps and saying he was saying go into the Capitol. The reason why it's never been particularly anomalous to me is because it wasn't. There was a lot of people that were discussing that, especially at a much higher level in the protest movement. They were, Ali Alexander specifically talking about how, they needed to storm Capitol buildings, didn't need to get permits for protests. And he said a lot more incendiary things other than that throughout that buildup. And then even just people, within the crowd on the street, sincerely or not, but there was a lot of discussion about that sort of activity. So that's, especially in retrospect, I can look at that and say, okay, there was something going on. Even up to when I was in Phoenix, this was kind of a famous moment and again, not knowing who any of these people are, I actually saw Baked Alaska, who's the guy who called out Ray Epps, fed.
Right.
So Baked Alaska was talking to another guy that I'm not sure who he is, and saying something about how he was bringing Jewish subversion into the atmosphere, and, you need to leave, and this is, America first, and that sort of attitude. And Ray Epps walks up and he actually confronts Baked Alaska and says, no, this is America. This is America, and everybody has a right to speak. And it was just this weird moment. And of course, not knowing who they were at the time, you look back in retrospect, and Baked Alaska, he says to Ray Epps, "Oh, I know, or whatever." And then Epps kind of walks away. And I said on my stream, I said, I don't know. I kind of like that. I kind of like what that guy had to say. And this is where it gets even weirder. So then I turn the camera around and people are on my stream and they're commenting, right? And they're like, "Oh, are the Trumpers going to riot?" And I said, they're doing all right. I don't think they're ready to riot yet.
And what day is this?
That would have been November 29th of 2020.
And did you say Phoenix?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Rudy Giuliani and others were at I can't remember which hotel it was, but I was staying in that hotel.
Okay.
And they were presenting their evidence of election fraud to the Republican Arizona state legislature, members of that. So that's why they were there. And that's, I even heard Ali Alexander speaking with like Michelle Malkin and others who were kind of in the organizational structure of that. When I was sitting in the hotel lobby, they were talking about that. It was bizarre. And I texted my mom and I told her, I said, I don't know, we'll see how things go later on tonight, because it sure sounded like there was an active push to kind of occupy the Arizona state capitol right then and there. Mm-hmm. So I didn't know if that was going to go on later or whatever, just being a fly on the wall.
At the time, that was people upset about the election results, the fact that Arizona had been called in that way. There was a Kerry Lake issue, right?
Yep.
All these things were happening at the same time. Yeah, it's hard to step back into that space unless you are physically in it, and it means more to you than it does to me. It's very interesting. So as people are kind of flashing back on where they were, this is the end of 2020.
Yeah.
And we were also in the grip of, I think I was probably homesick with COVID at the time.
Yeah.
You know, so that was a real thing, and people were really getting sick, and we really didn't have a ton of answers about what the end result was, other than we probably knew somebody who had been sick and was okay, and we heard about a lot of people dying allegedly.
Yeah.
That was when the death tickers were running.
Sure. That was a theme through all of it. You know, you had the kind of the point of contrast between Trump supporters who were largely unmasked and Antifa that would be counter demonstrating or whatever. They had their masks. That was also the first time I ever met Jake Chansley. Spoke with him for a while there, took some pictures of him, recorded some of his speeches. You know, interesting guy. So it's, you know, you could feel things building, and that is what it is. I mean, I know that people say that everything was orchestrated, and, you know, we can kind of get into that, because on December 12th, when I went out for the second major Trump rally, that was kind of when things really took a turn, in my opinion, especially looking back on it. Was that it immediately started out very confrontational between Antifa, BLM elements in DC, and, you know, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, 3%ers, you know, those various groups. And then you just had kind of random Trump supporters that were coming into town, and they were getting involved in it as well.
Right. Who or what was funding you to go to those places? Was this self-funded?
That was me. Yeah. That was me.
And what made you think it was worth your money, time, experience? Did you have a sense of where you were in history, or like what drove you?
I think so. I knew it was momentous. I knew that there was something to be said about Trump. You have a, you know, disputed election. There's only so many ways that can go. And, you know, when I initially kind of decided, okay, well, I'm going to try to tell the story of Proud Boys, was where I was at, because that's who I'd interacted with the most. You know, kind of built some pretty good cordial relationships with them. They tended to respect my independence, because they would ask, "Oh, what are you doing?" I'm a journalist, you know, and they're like, "You're just walking around here by yourself?" And I'm like, "Yeah," you know, so there was kind of some respect given over that, and it was cool. And I felt like their story needed to be told, because what I was seeing in that was not what the media was showing of them. You know, the media was saying, "Oh, they're all white supremacists," which that wasn't true. There's an element of truth to that, in that Proud Boys are a very pro-free speech organization, and there was never any efforts to get rid of people who didn't subscribe to, you know, neo-Nazi ideology or whatever. But I didn't feel like we were seeing the complete picture, because again, what I saw was entrepreneurial guys who saw something wrong with their country, didn't know how to take action, and this is how they decided to find meaning or purpose in what they were doing. And so I thought that was a very interesting story. And that developed even more around the protest of the 12th, you know, where there was so much going on. There were multiple altercations, but there was one particular one by Lafayette Square. Or it's actually, it's the one that's further north. Is it McPherson? Is that right?
Maybe. We'll have to look at a map.
I'd have to look at a map, but it's
Here,
north of the White House.
I'll look at a map while you're talking.
It's north of the White House.
Okay.
And so BLM Antifa had essentially taken over that entire park, is what it is. It's got some trees and stuff. And the police had set up a line on the east side of that area, and you had a very large number of Proud Boys who'd begun marching from Harry's restaurant, where they kind of hung out, and the Hotel Harrington down there. They had gone up there kind of in order to engage with Antifa elements.
You said it was
to whatever degree.
It's north of Lafayette, correct?
Yes.
So Farragut Square is most likely.
Is that what it is?
Does that sound right?
It doesn't sound right.
And McPherson Square is the other direction. They're equal directions. Okay. So Lafayette's kind of at the middle of the X.
Okay, so then I believe so. If you
McPherson,
that's what.
Okay, so McPherson's same distance in the other way. So yes. Farragut is up if you were to go north and west. If you go north and east, you end up at McPherson. Okay, so that's where they were.
Yeah, so that's where they were. And so there was
not
kind
relevant,
of this,
but why not?
Kind of relevant. It's interesting when you look into the idea of the way police may have been moving people, and you know, there's a lot of funny business there. A lot of times it did feel like there were certain efforts that were made that encouraged, and maybe not that, but everybody was getting intel. So you had we know that Enrique Tarrio was in communication with Shane Lamond, who was with the police.
Yeah,
So,
DC Metro.
Yeah, you know that there was some feeding back and forth, and I guarantee you there's Antifa elements that were getting the same information. What are police doing? How can we get around these lines? How can we engage with our enemy? Which is all very bizarre. It's like, oh, you've got the cops that always separate them, so how serious are you guys really about fighting if you're not willing to just bulldoze the cops as well? Just kind of bizarre. It's almost like a constant state of siege between two armies.
And also kind of testing those limits, almost like toddlers, like finding out where mom and dad are going to let us go and have the interaction together, right?
Very much like that. You know,
I like the toddler analogy more than a siege because it just seemed dumb.
Yeah, but it's very much like a lot of LARPing, frankly, where I think I lost you, so I don't know if my feed's still going through.
No, it is LARPy.
But, you know, so that's what it was.
I saw the same thing in Portland for whatever it's worth. You know, Shawn, so
I saw exactly.
That LARPy behavior of like, I literally heard people yell charge, which is hilarious for, you know, late teen, early 20 morons with wooden riot shields running at cops who are twice their size, physically probably have 2x their body weight. It's like, would like, you run that NFL lineman?
And I'm not sitting here condoning violence, but how serious are you if you haven't gotten the guns out? This is America.
That is also part of it.
It's not like they're hard to
how
find.
Serious are you if you're yelling retreat and running into people's backyards and then, like, you know, massing forces and then running back into the park again to get knocked over again? It's comical as hell to watch through night vision. I'm just going to tell you straight up, it is very funny.
I believe it.
But it's not serious.
There's a lot of funny elements. And even when I was streaming, I would just make fun of a lot of it while I was on live stream. I mean, I was just being myself. That's how I'm going to handle it. I'm just like, oh yeah, look at this guy over here. Here's what the cops are doing. You know, and that's the way it was. You know, you had people sneaking around, but there was one particular incident where apparently somebody had gotten across the lines there, stabbed somebody, and then he was escaping. Proud Boys chased, tackled, kicked, cops came in, pepper spray goes everywhere. And then I just remember sitting there thinking, as I watched Proud Boys really start to confront cops at that moment, I said, I don't think the thin blue line's going to hold. And I thought that to myself.
Interesting.
This is turning into a confrontation, not between Proud Boys, not between right-wing elements and Antifa. It's turning into a confrontation between them and police, which when you look at it from a subversive Antifa kind of plotted out sort of goal, that's pretty ideal. That was a pretty ideal situation to get Trump supporters to, where they felt more confrontational with police. And despite what anybody's going to say about that, especially here 4 years later, that was a very crucial moment in all of it, in my mind, 100%. Because that's when people realized that maybe the cops weren't there to protect their values.
So, well, I guess the crazy, you know, in a warfare scenario, this is having a strike team that's running out and doing kind of like raids and luring somebody back into a much bigger massed conventional force. So you go from unconventional to conventional. If you can lure them into a big ambush, and that ambush happens to be, you know, the DC Metro Police Force, which does all of its work in rioting. They're very good at riot control. Yeah. They kind of suck at most
very
other
good
things.
Or very bad, but, you know, depending on how you look at it with their history.
Well, they physically are capable of responding to riots at a very, very short notice and in a quick way, and they have the ability to arrest a lot of people if they wanted to. They also tend to not have that much investigative capabilities, and then it's whether or not the U.S. Attorney's Office will take it. So, all right. I think it's a really interesting framing of the tactics, and it does go to a deeper sort of question of, you know, like how organized were these Antifa types? Is Antifa an idea to you, or is it a group?
It's a bit of both. I think it's like MAGA on some level. I think that, you know, from what I saw from the inside of Antifa, you know, Portland, Denver, was that you had leadership that's very, very much so true believers in what they're doing. They put the time in, they study, they understand how to, you know, conduct revolution. And then you have useful idiots, which are, there's going to be useful idiots in any sort of political movement. So, you know, I think, you know, like Nadler, and by the way, they didn't like it that I called him a fat pig fuck. So I'm going to go ahead and just remind everybody that's objectively true. But
Which
Jerry
one is this?
Nadler, Gerald Nadler.
Is he Nadler or is he Nadler?
I don't know. Nadler. I don't know. He's this, people know who he is.
He's detestable. He's
really
so
gross. Yeah. But when he said, "Oh, Antifa's a myth," I remember that. And that's just shut up. The level of gaslighting there is just disgusting.
Yeah.
But that's typical for all the politicians. So he shouldn't feel like I'm just picking on him. But the idea that
he is the most detestable, though. He's really detestable,
and that's the great armor that Antifa does have, is that they lean into that. They say, "Oh, it's not organized. Oh, it's just an idea." That's just simply not true. There's organization to it. They essentially do it out in the open through various socialist groups. They know what they're doing, especially on a high level. They're students. They read. They understand how to break a society up, and quite frankly, probably a fair amount of them are probably getting paid by the Russian government, the Chinese government, or whoever else is interested in destroying this country. So, that is what it is.
Yeah, and likely not directly. I mean, through cutouts, through, foundations or NGOs and stuff.
That's right. There's too much to be gained by drumming up that that trauma, that strife between Americans, and that division. So that's really what we were saying. But again, crucial point was the division that I then saw building, where it was no longer the attitude of back the blue amongst a lot of people who had been protesting in the streets of DC for 2 months. So
how much of that do you think also came from viral type videos, whether they were organically viral or not, of cops enforcing COVID tyranny across the country?
All of that played into it. You saw this, and it was 100% psychological warfare, where people are bombarded with that information that reinforces their deeply held beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
That's what was happening in 2020. And even to myself, to a degree, I look back at different things I was consuming, different things I was believing, and I can kind of look at myself and go, wow, you really were kind of radicalized, Shawn. Because up here, despite what was going on here or what I was doing on the ground, I never engaged in violence or anything like that. But I was certainly being radicalized by what I was seeing on the ground. It was horrible. It was awful. Seeing the way, the police were behaving. And then, of course, that gets reinforced by whatever's in your feed. You're seeing more of it. You're pissed off about the COVID tyranny. I was pissed off what it was doing to my plumbing business at the time. I was losing money. So it's like, why do you go out and you spend $70 on a shot of whiskey? Well, I might not have it next week. Eat, drink, and be merry, tomorrow we die. And then you're looking at essentially what's an existential crisis for the constitutional republic. If an election is allowed to be stolen, those are very serious things. People, if you believe those on any level, you have every right to be very angry. And this is kind of when we talk about this, I don't know that I've gotten this nasty about it, but it probably needs to be happening, especially now that I'm off probation by the time this ends. But there is a certain righteous indignation involved in everything that happened, both in the lead up and afterward. The only thing that I've always kind of cautioned back because of what I saw there was ideological subversion, which is you have to look at the bigger picture. You have to look at the powers that are outside of the United States, or even nefarious actors within the United States who stand to benefit from the division that occurs when good Americans believe that they are acting in their own best interests, but they don't see the bigger picture. They don't see how it's all going to play out. And I think that's really what led to January 6th. More than anything, if people want to talk about feds that were in the crowd, I still haven't seen any evidence that really leads me to believe that, and we've talked about this, that there was some guy on the FBI payroll telling everybody, yeah, storm the Capitol. I haven't seen evidence.
Yep.
Of anybody acting.
What's funny is that strikes me as a red herring. How about you?
Yeah, it does. It really does. I mean, when I look back, and I've said this before, even to friends of mine that I consider to be my friends, I look at things that, David Summerall was saying. And I didn't know him before January 6th. I met him in the aftermath. My buddy Trennis Evans. There was a lot of rhetoric. People were on megaphones saying, oh, we need to take our problems there. Trennis has been, lambasted for saying, yeah, next time we need to come back with ropes. People don't understand the kind of hyperbole and just inflammatory rhetoric that was commonplace. So they see a video of Ray Epps and they're told by Benny Johnson that Ray Epps is the guy who stormed, orchestrated the Capitol. And then he goes in front of the J6 committee and says, I orchestrated it. And then you have Raskin and the rest of them come out and defend the guy. It's like, why do you think they're doing that? It's the same thing with Antifa when they essentially do things to try to cause that conflict. That's why it's always seemed like a red herring to me. It's like, why are they going to give you these easy answers when it's a much more complex event? And you're not looking around.
Yeah, what do you think the actual because I don't think we need to have feds involved for it to have still been sort of operational subversion going on.
No.
Who would you trigger it to?
Well, what I've
really good obvious actors.
Sure. I mean, I don't want to sit here and say with any sort of definitive statement that certain people were on an orchestration level, but when you look at people who have sexual proclivities that could be used as blackmail against them, boy, that's a target. That's a target for foreign intelligence. It's probably a target for malicious actors within domestic intelligence. That's the kind of person that you want. Because then you have leverage where you start to inject whatever narrative it is that you want. Even when we look at what's happened with Tenet Media, and that they were essentially allegedly getting money from Russian spies there. Why do people think they would do that? It's not because they care about the ideology of the people that they're influencing. They just want to drum up the divisions. So they want these certain videos to go viral. I think that that's a lot of the reason why we saw so much of the drag queen story time, which again, I'm not sitting here and defending it. It's detestable, but it makes people viscerally angry. And when you constantly bombard people with information that makes them angry, they're not going to be thinking about what they're doing, and they're going to do stupid things. So that's the
take that back to where you were doing satire.
Yeah.
In a small place many people have never heard of in New Mexico.
Yeah.
Let's take it back there and talk about just that you were doing it on a small scale, I assume.
Yeah.
But you said you like to make yourself angry as a writer.
Yeah.
Why is it so effective?
Because your rational thinking gets lost. When you get angry, you're not thinking rationally and you make mistakes. Mm-hmm. And modern media of all shades, not just left-wing mainstream media, they do their job of making sure the left is adequately pissed off at Donald Trump and that they think he's, orange man bad. But right-wing media is just as guilty of this. And if you don't click your heels with these guys, they cut you out. And that's happened to me. You will push what they want to push. Now, why? The easy answer is, well, that's where the money is, because this is how our media has been divided into this left-wing and right-wing crap. It's a lie. It's just a lie. It doesn't even exist. It's just a manipulative tactic. It's divide and conquer. And that's what I've watched. That's what I see. And part of the problem is that because of the tactics that work on people who are kind of more progressive socially, if you want to troll them, you kind of have to do it out of the mouth of a scientist. And they've done that. They made these people click their heels, run around with masks, talk about studies about bias and police brutality and how the system needs to be burned down and capitalism is evil and all these other things. All these, as my buddy Thad Preston, he would just say, well, this is Karen's gone wild. And it is very much so. And then on the other side of the equation, you have people that are worried about losing their gun rights, worried about drag queen story time, all the way up to and including, the people who've now started to espouse the ideas of Adolf Hitler as somehow being the best thing in the world, which I predicted back at the end of 2023. I said we would see a resurgence of neo-Nazi ideology in this country in a way that we hadn't experienced ever. And the reason why I could look back...
people that are doing that?
Well, Stu Peters for one of them. Stu Peters for one of them, which Stu Peters I knew well. I helped Stu Peters launch his podcast. I gave him his first guest. I have watched him grow from a guy who was a legitimate investigator with what appeared to be legitimate motives of investigating, finding truth, being skeptical about everything, to someone who now 100% wholeheartedly is pushing Adolf Hitler as being some sort of messiah. It's wild. And the only motivator I can see through all that without knowing the inner details of all that is money. And
yeah, so I don't even know who Stu Peters is, unfortunately. I know that he's invited me on his program and I've never been a part of it. Can you Can you give me a primer on Stu Peters?
It was Stu.
I mean, because that's fascinating.
Yeah,
Somebody that's going to decide.
Yeah, he was a bounty hunter. He was a bounty hunter before he went pro on radio. So he was friends with ACTJ, my network of people that I know and love. He was on ACTJ, I think, on January 3rd, prior to January 6th, in which he had already proclaimed that it would be called Patriots Day. He was a big talker. Very much so, talking about, I'm the people's bullhorn and all that and everything else. But, after I got charged, I asked him to write a letter saying that I contributed correspondence to him in the months ahead of January 6th, because I did. And he refused to write the letter. Bro, I just can't have that kind of federal pressure on me. They shut me down. It'd just be too much. Which was ridiculous, because the guy who helped him push his show is a guy named Ron Hammond with Ops Lens Media. When I asked Ron to do the same thing, no problem. Wrote me a letter. When I asked my buddy Rocky Stucci, no problem. Wrote me a letter. So anybody who thinks that Stu Peters, I'm not even going to get into what I know about him personally. He'll have to deal with that on his own one of these days. But my personal experiences with him was somebody who's a big talker, but when the chips were down, he wasn't willing to do anything. Not even write a freaking letter, and then of course, he would have me on his show after that, but it's all about content to him. He doesn't care. It's just money. He's not even interested in the truth anymore, so far as I can tell.
Was he bringing on the guy that's the chiropractor? I'm trying to recall where I saw this guy first.
He's had everybody on. I mean, he was like the number 2 podcast in the United States at one point. Yeah.
He had the what?
Yeah, he had like the number 2 podcast in the United States at one point. His reach was massive. That's when he got the big.
They were talking about like COVID was a snake poison that was being injected. It was cobra venom, right?
Yes.
This is like loony. This is overnight radio weird shit.
It's like flat Earth shit.
Yeah, but I mean, here's the thing. That's super entertaining at midnight on terrestrial radio if you're driving a truck in the middle of the desert.
Oh yeah, it's great.
It really is. I mean, it's great. It's great. Just let the guest call in and say wild stuff. Have this guy on. He's an expert in, plasmidic anti-propulsion, negative reactor science. And you're like, oh, yeah, this guy's cool. Like, what is he like? That's fun for entertainment.
Yeah.
But this entertainment crossed into informing people and also sort of directing people, it seems like.
And it's super destructive. It's super destructive.
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to say it, and people don't like it. I know we've all been bombarded with the censorship, and the terms misinformation, disinformation so much to where people don't even understand the difference or the idea of a difference between a disinformation space and a misinformation space, because there is pretty stark difference between those two things. People, what they fail to understand even at this point is the way the truth can be used to manipulate their behavior. And that's what's so sad about this kind of era of psychological warfare that we're in, that I've observed, experienced, and even up to the point, this is the other thing, I've long talked about, various connections I have and sources within the intelligence community. Do I for any second think that those meetings were accidental? No. I'm well aware of what's going on with that, which is why I've heard much more from these people than I've ever reported, because I just assume everything that I'm hearing is some sort of bullshit red herring that I go out there and I ends up doing their job for them as a counterintelligence officer. I don't know. I've done pretty good over the years, not just running with crap, but I think some people, they get approached, they run with it. That's what I think.
Especially if it affirms what they want to believe.
Sure. It's a very ugly game, and I understand why it's played as well. I don't, America's at a pretty intense crossroads, particularly after January 6th. You have multiple entities that seek to influence and control us. And, it's information warfare. It's 5th generation warfare.
The crime on January 6th that you were accused, and then what was the legal status, your outcome there?
So the crime was illegal walking around with a camera, is what I've basically boiled it down to, and a breach of objectivity as a journalist. There was a moment in the hallway, particularly, where there was kind of a confrontation between police and protesters. And for whatever reason, I felt like saying something, which was kind of out of character in a lot of ways. To say anything sincere, particularly, I was usually sarcastic in all my interactions. And I said, brother, stand with us. And that was used by the DOJ to then say that I had aligned myself with rioters, and so therefore I wasn't, going to get the protections of a journalist being there. Part of me can understand that.
Is there any reason why that is not First Amendment protected?
Well, the trespassing isn't First Amendment protected, obviously.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Obviously there's a statute for picketing and parading in a Capitol building. Whether we think that statute is constitutional or not, that's something that'll have to be addressed. That was part of my problem, was that the statutes that they applied, if you looked at the violation, it made sense to a degree up until the motive, that willingly. That was what I struggled with most of all, right? So if you're taking a plea, especially for me, I had to get to a point where I could honestly look at the judge and say, yes, I'm guilty of this. So that's what I did. I got myself into a mind space, probably, maybe that's a bit of the manipulation on some level, I just didn't feel like I could make that argument, rightly or wrongly, in the District of Columbia. Maybe in other districts, I would have had a more successful argument saying, look, that's not that big a deal. And even to this day, I don't think that it was a wise decision for the Department of Justice to continue charging me. I don't think it was wise for the Department of Justice to charge misdemeanor defendants at all. Just made no sense. Even up to the special agent in my case, he wasn't impressed with it either. He just said this is a giant waste of time and money. He was busy doing real investigative work. And he didn't need to be worried about somebody who walked around and took some pictures, whether they were a journalist or not. And so to me, that's the ugliest thing out of all of January 6th, without getting to every detail of the day, is that the Department of Justice was weaponized. We saw a bunch of misdemeanor defendants get wrapped up. And from what I've seen, that's obfuscated the prosecution or investigation of people who potentially were behaving nefariously that day with, malicious intent. It bogged down the system with a bunch of...
Well, there are some egregious cases, right? You don't think your case was as egregious? Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
No.
Because you had a breach of objectivity. Does that make you feel like you actually do? I mean, you accepted culpability, but it sounds like you actually also sort of really do accept that culpability a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's a responsibility, I think, as a journalist to maintain objectivity in that particular situation. I'm not saying people shouldn't have opinions or anything like that, but it was definitely a little bit too gonzo. And it was a little bit out of character for me, which was bizarre. Even, when I think back, and, my mom's even told me, she's like, I don't know why you did that. It just doesn't make sense. It's not who you are. But I don't know. I felt like it was the right thing to say at the right time, and I did it. And I don't really regret it. Regret and responsibility are two different things.
Sure.
In my mind. But when you look at the egregious cases, it's like I told you, I think, somebody who I was, kind of told by a lot of people within the J6 community to hate was Tim Hale. And, he was held in the DC Correctional Treatment Facility without bail for the entirety of it, spent the better part of the 3 years, more than 3 years in. And he was just a misdemeanor defendant. They stuck him with the 1512 obstruction, right? They hit him with that felony to kind of justify it even more so, which that was a joke and a farce.
Yeah.
But really the reason why his case is so egregious is because he wasn't even given the opportunity to be released on his own recognizance. And the reason why he wasn't given that opportunity was, it boils down to the fact that he had dressed up like Hitler a couple of times and made jokes that are inappropriate. And a lot of people have said, oh, no, he's really a neo-Nazi and yada, yada. And I kind of don't really, I think he was being very satirical, maybe with a little bit of, this is just my subjective opinions at this point, but, maybe a little bit of that kind of East Coast racial tension that anybody who's ever spent time in the East Coast knows about. The Italians and the Jews and the blacks, they don't always get along, and they kind of say nasty things about each other, whether or not they really, really, really hold on to them or not. It's just kind of a cultural thing that I've observed.
Cultural, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like New Mexico. It's like New Mexico. I grew up with people of all races. Everybody says derogatory things about each other. So that, whatever. There's definitely a satirical element, but that's the reason they held him, was they didn't like things that he had said that had nothing to do with rioting, had nothing to do with planning the riot. So there was no argument to be made, but they went ahead and they just held him. So when we talk about things that were egregious, to me, that one is really at the heart of it, because that is 100%, a violation and an infringement of his First Amendment rights. And that's something that always frustrates me, is people always talk about, the Second Amendment protects the First Amendment. Well, if you're not willing to exercise the First Amendment and you're being punished for that and you're just taking it and you're laying down, well, then what does it matter? By the time they get to taking away the guns, you're already tame. So that's why we have to protect offensive speech more than anything. And that was one thing that I'll say that drew me to Proud Boys and made me understand a little bit more about them, was this inherent desire within their tenets to protect offensive speech. Because if you can't protect that as a society, you don't have free speech.
Yeah. Non-offensive speech doesn't require any protection.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, this does seem self-evident to those who pay attention to it. Like, what other speech is going to be objected to? Except objectionable speech. It's literally what it is. Things that make people uncomfortable.
Yeah. Whether rightly or wrongly.
So show me. And this is the same way that we talk about the prison system or the justice system. It's like, if you can't protect the rights of the accused, then nobody else's rights matter either. Because until you're accused of a crime, it's completely irrelevant whether you have a right to a speedy trial or, cruel and unusual. Like, look at the people that are accused of the most heinous crime and treat them fairly. That's the American idea. It's revolutionary too.
Yeah,
it was at the time, and it is still.
Yeah, I mean, if we don't have that, we might as well just go back to having an absolute monarchy and hope that the king's pretty good. I mean, that's what people would.
They are, aren't they?
Oh, America.
Okay.
Yeah, everybody wants a dictator in this world right now. It's very creepy.
It's very strange. So one of the things that I've been kind of reflecting on is this elevation of a concept, Donald Trump, the MAGA king. This is going back a year now, probably. You remember that?
Mm-hmm.
And so the left called him the great MAGA king, and that was a Biden, but it was some speechwriter that wrote it, and they made it out to be a problem, and Trump trolls them by embracing it, and the right embraced it and confirmed everything that the left thought. Tell me the mechanics you saw behind any of that kind of stuff. Because, I mean, I know you were thinking about it when it happened, because it's got some Lord of the Rings imagery too.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's funny even into the, the terminology where, MAGA in Latin means witch. We've talked about this. So it's interesting to me. Words are interesting to me. Because as someone who's studied the esoteric even, I can understand words are essentially spells. That's why we spell our words. It's no joke. If you say specific words, that can have power. It's Nancy Pelosi with her chicken bones again. But I think people are primed right now to accept that kind of level of power, and it's interesting to watch even as we move into this, second Trump administration. The kind of level of power that it seems people are willing to cede to a president in order to free us from the swamp. And it's concerning to me, Kyle. I don't think it's healthy. I think that there's a certain level of truth, and that's not to say that everybody who voted for Donald Trump is a cult member. I voted for him again. We talked about that, my reasoning for that. Mm-hmm. But I think Americans need to be careful that we adhere to the constitutional values that we should, and not get sucked into this cult of personality, because I've just seen it happen too many times in history. And it may not be Trump that tips us over the edge. America is on the brink anyways after 70 years of empire, where it's becoming very difficult for a representative democracy, a republic, to rule an empire. And it would be a lot easier to just get rid of the corruption, and have a king. And I think that's something even we see played out in the Bible when they had the judges, right? And the Israelites, they didn't want the judges anymore. It was too complicated. They said, we want a king that works so much better. Be careful what you wish for. And I think that a lot of people, subconsciously or otherwise, they wish for that. They want a king. And it was very bizarre. Even Elon Musk, speaking about the problems over in Great Britain and the United Kingdom. And he was essentially agreeing and calling for King Charles to dissolve Parliament and deal with it. Like, really? That's where we're at. That's the kind of things we're putting into the universe now. It's gross. And given the right sort of crisis in this country, we could very easily slip into dictatorship. And boy, if that happens, then what was the point of any of this? I've often thought, I remember being in the rotunda of the Capitol and looking up and looking at the apotheosis of Washington, which is a very interesting painting, but it was just beautiful. And I remember thinking to myself in that moment, people are being crushed around me. I recently reposted that video. I was fairly certain there was a decent possibility I could die in that crowd. People may joke and laugh at that, but it was not comfortable, very difficult to breathe, and bad things happen. But I looked up and I just thought to myself, I said, this is it. This is it. And I really, really hope that turns out to be wrong.
So far, so good this year.
Yeah. We're live.
What did you think about the January 6th 4-year anniversary? The fact that we had people that were, arrested over it were also there to witness the certification by the person who lost in that election. What do you think that means anything, or is that more? What is that?
I can take an incredibly cynical view. I have my
do it. Come
approach.
On now.
Look, I when you talk about elements of the deep state and how much manipulation goes on with the election, it's very difficult for me to believe that it was just too big to rig. I don't believe that for a second. With everything I've seen, deals get made in smoky rooms all the time. And we, the people, the peasants, end up dealing with the consequences of those deals. Whatever they are. Good, bad, whatever. I don't believe Donald Trump lost the election. But it is my personal belief and opinion that he was allowed to win. By the very same people who manipulated the last election, and the election before that, and the election before that, going back as far as you want. Now, does that mean Donald Trump is evil? No, not necessarily. What that means is he's someone who in the last 8 years has a lot better understanding of how the gears of power in Washington, D.C. work. And he probably understood at some point, if I want to be back in as president, I'm going to have to cut a deal. Again, I don't have any direct evidence of this. This is pure speculation.
Sure.
But, that could be the sign of a man who does value the Republic above himself. Could be that. Because he would understand what needs to be done for him to try to fix things. Very well could be what's going on. Problem is, it could be the other.
In theory, that's what politics is, right? It's
Sure.
compromise. It's like, okay, fine, I'm willing to give you the things you need in order to accomplish the things that I want.
And if you understand the nature of the state, we've had this conversation. There's a reason why, the first time I ever spoke with you, I said that philosophically I'm an anarchist, but pragmatically I'm a constitutionalist. But the reality of the nature of state and power is that it is corrupt. Because it's administered by human beings. And we are inherently corrupt. So I don't know why people think that a government instituted among men by men is going to somehow be divine in its application in our lives. No, it's going to be quite different. In fact, if we believe that we're a fallen creature, then pretty much anything that we put our minds to is going to be inherently satanic. So
That's heavy.
you know,
It does go back to the opening. Look, I never know where we're going to take any of these things, especially when I'm talking to you. So I appreciate you taking the ride with me. I mean, we just jump in, we drop the quarter and see where we land. It reminds me that we started talking about the fallen nature of man and whether or not we're rational creatures. And it does feel like the Constitution is a imposition or an overlay of rationality. It's an attempt.
Yeah. A very good attempt. I mean, the Declaration of Independence, these founding documents, when you sit down and you read them, you just realize how much thought these men put into every single word. And they really did intend for it to last and to build something better. But I think even they would be cynical about how long it would last. You know, Ben Franklin famously said, "You have a republic if you can keep it." Here we are. So I think this kind of relates back to something I've always talked about, is personal responsibility. When you asked earlier, you know, what would you change anything? Well, no. My life has been a series of a lot of mistakes and painful things. Lots of tears, lots of joy along the way too. And I wouldn't have gotten to that point in my timeline had I not experienced those. But all I can do is take from the mistakes that I've learned in my past, my faults as a person, and strive every day to try to be better, to try to be a more uplifted exhibition of God's creation. And that's all any of us can do. So when we talk about what we do for our republic, we'll focus on being a better person yourself. Start there. Because that's how you fix it. That's the only way you fix it.
Where do you see this going in the next couple of years? Are you able to conjure any of your revelation out for us that we can see, satirical or otherwise? And are you seeing anything starting to manifest?
I think there's a lot of ways it could go badly. You know, for a lot of reasons, a lot of things line up. I mean, where my imagination goes is some sort of apocalyptic catastrophe that really wakes us up to the true nature of ourselves. You know, revelation is a painful process, I think, which is really what I was getting to right there. A lot of people talk about, you know, biblical prophecy and what they see. You know, it's interesting to watch all of the various geopolitical players position themselves around Israel right now, kind of almost playing by the script. You know, we have conflicts coming up with China that I don't think are particularly avoidable. We'll see how that plays out. It seems as though we may have really backed ourselves into a corner in our relationship with Russia. That, you know, it would be good if we could somehow repair that, because I think that was a bright spot in history that was a missed opportunity by George W. Bush to really strengthen that relationship. And now we're in a situation where China and Russia are pretty much completely aligned against us. That's not a good situation for the United States. I think we've had a very arrogant attitude that needs to be curbed a bit. Funny enough, you know, some of the more exciting things or bright spots or good ideas that I've seen Trump have, you know, is like to have a great American fair. He's talked about that. In order to celebrate the 250th anniversary. I think that's a great idea. I think that we need to revitalize some form of patriotism. We need to revitalize a belief in the Constitution. And without that, I don't think we'll survive. So I think that's hugely important. And I think that's a good idea. I mean, even to the point where he makes jokes about Canada and Greenland and who knows what's real and who isn't. But I've laughed and I've said part of the problem with the United States is that we have all the responsibilities of a world empire with none of the real benefits. We don't exact tribute from our vassal states. We give them money. And then we exact it back. That's complicated. I mean, we essentially launder our own money through these vassal states, but that's the nature of the military industrial complex. What are you going to do? But
sure,
it's complex. I think that, as Americans, we need to focus on the things that unite us rather than the things that divide us. I think that that's how we win in the end. I'm hopeful that we can, because if we don't, I essentially see two roads for us. I've said either, militarization or balkanization, meaning that we better embrace this new world order where the United States is at the head of it, and we have to go to war to defend that hegemony, or we completely split and we balkanize. And somehow, even if we go through this militarization phase as we deal with our declining empire and the rise of, the Eastern kind of BRICS axis as a competitive system, we have to maintain our constitutional values because, again, that's all that matters. Without that, the idea is dead. And it's a great idea. So, as far as how that plays out, I don't know. I could get into a lot of dark spaces, as you know, but I don't know if that's where I want to encourage people to go. Because what I saw years ago was an incredible amount of light and heat. In many ways kind of interpreted kind of like the birth of a star or a thermonuclear explosion. And then after that, I don't really have much. So as far as whatever glimpse I was given, a little more than 5 years ago, is it 5 years? Yeah. A little more than 5 years ago, that glimpse that I was apparently given, that's kind of how it left me a little bit. So you could look at that, you could say, well, is that the end? Well, I don't think there really is an end, number one. We're all just experiencing it. We're trying to understand each other. And I think, we've been given pretty firm directives across a variety of religious beliefs over the years, including Christianity, that we're to love our neighbor. So I don't know. Maybe that's what we should try to do. And if we learn something along the way, great.
It is certainly, it feels like it is counter to most of the programming, at least for the men I deal with, but I think women probably fall into the same category. We have a real hard time with loving our enemy and doing good to those who hate us.
Yeah.
It's so, that's the fundamental challenge. I think that's why Christianity is so incredibly powerful to people, even those who don't subscribe to it. You better acknowledge how revolutionary those ideas are.
It's unnatural.
Because it's counter to everything. It's unnatural. It's an unnatural, it is a flipping of the biological script that we are wired to handle.
Which is why it's supernatural. So, if you can't explain it on that, and it's interesting. I was actually having a conversation about just the idea of Christianity and what it is, what it means to me, right? Because I'm not somebody, as you know, I don't go out and make it central to my messaging. I don't say, hey, I'm a Christian. I don't even really like the term, to be honest, because of all the negative connotation we've seen through the years, how that spiritual belief has been manipulated by people in power to manipulate people, to convince them to go kill other people, when that's completely antithetical to the idea, to what Christ taught. Christ wouldn't have you go out and kill other people. He would teach you to love them more than yourself. So, and that's not a very good way to run a state either. You can't play that
really
way.
Really effective.
Yeah, you can't play that way. You can't let North Korea attack you and you say, well, turn the other cheek. But that's even on the deeper level of why I say that the state is inherently evil. It's a bit of a catch-22. And so that kind of relates back to that, well, what do you do in that situation? Well, your only choice is to make yourself a better person in whatever capacity you can, understanding that you are fallen, you are flawed. And so that's, to me, that's the lesson of Christianity. And so to that degree of how people believe, I can respect those beliefs. As long as you don't try to, round me up into an army saying Deus Vult and let's go kill all those stinking brown people. That's just, it makes me go, I don't know about that. But we'll see how it plays out. I always say, come quickly, Lord Jesus. So, because I don't have much faith in humanity at all.
I think that's, if nothing else, that's what most of us have walked away with, if we're going to get down to the root of it in the last few years.
That's a good thing.
Anybody,
right?
And I actually think it's the resurgence of traditional church, more traditional, more austere, people that are really hard line. You're seeing that pop up. My wife started wearing a veil to church, which is neither here nor there, but it was like, did we lose modesty? Am I contributing to it? How do I take that away? I'm going to go and do something. I'm going to wear a veil on my head.
Sure. No, I understand it. It's funny if I haven't made it a habit to even attend church or do anything like that, but I've often said that, if I was going to, it would probably be Orthodox. There's just, I think that there's something to be said for ritual, whatever that is, and putting yourself in a correct frame of mind to respect what it is that you're experiencing. I think that's why people are drawn to it. That's also why people manipulate that. But I can understand the thinking that would lead somebody to that. If that helps you and you feel as though that helps you become a better person, well, then by all means, I like that. We should all be doing that. So,
when you were overseas, you did some time in the UK, did some time in Armenia. What other countries did you hit?
That's it. Ireland, Scotland, but that's it. And then I got locked down.
Did you go?
Had big plans.
Right. Did you visit any churches, historical churches, things that had been there for hundreds or maybe 1,000 years? Did you see any?
Yeah, I saw some of the first churches ever built, some of the first Christian churches ever built. They're in Armenia, the oldest Christian graveyard in the world, the oldest Christian cemetery is in Armenia. So I've seen what I was told was the oldest tombstone with a cross on it, which at that time it was different. It looked like a Y.
Okay.
A very rudimentary cross representing the tree. So that was incredibly powerful, yeah.
There's a power in sacred spaces, and we've sort of given up on them. I go into a lot of churches, and I just immediately look around. I go, this is a meeting hall. This is not a place that is sacred. But if you go into a place that is let's say, a cathedral, England has some, Ireland certainly has some, France has some, Germany, so on and so forth. You go into those places, and you know that the people who built them didn't see them completed. They literally worked their whole lives. And as somebody who's a tradesman, imagine working a building knowing that you are laying down plumbing and you're never going to see water run through it, ever.
Yeah.
And you're doing it because that's what part of your mission is. You're building something sacred that will be generational.
Yeah.
We lost that for some reason. Anyway, I agree. The return to the divine, man trying to not emulate the divine, but to touch the divine by creating a space for the divine to come in.
Yeah.
We used to do that as species.
Yeah, I think that that's a very human thing to do. The churches I entered over there were incredibly powerful. There's also a place, oh gosh, I'm getting tired. Boy, that's just skipping. Too many hits to the head over the years, Kyle. There's
these things happen.
There's standing stones in Armenia, and it's the oldest standing stones in the world. Karahunj. And they have these holes drilled through.
These are like a Neolithic structure?
Yeah, very old. And, nobody really knows what they're used for. There's actually a really interesting theory that they were the anchors off of the ark. There's somebody who's put that forward. They were the anchor stones that got dropped on the ark. And this place is like maybe 20 or 30 kilometers away from the place that's known as Noah's Vineyard, which is, traditionally the place where, when he decided to just get drunk after the whole flood incident and he just decided to drink his life away, apparently that's where he did it. It's the oldest wine presses in the world, which that wine there, again, is just magical in and of itself, out of the Arani Valley. So that was amazing. But then just even the Christian churches, the founding of Christianity, the first Christian kingdom there, these churches were built 300 AD. And like you say, the kind of time that has been put into them, they've rebuilt them after earthquakes, with great care. It's an incredible country, incredible spaces. I mean, it's funny, you talk about traditions, and, I was raised evangelical, so was not raised in any sort of kind of what I would say Orthodox or even traditional ritualistic belief, like we see with Roman Catholicism. Yep. And Orthodox. But, there was a church there, and it was actually on Lake Savon. And that church, I just felt moved, where I was like, well, I'm going to light a candle. Never done that before. But when you go into that kind of a building that's that old, it's all lit by candles. There's no artificial lighting at all made out of stone. Just the impression that it gives you is absolutely breathtaking. And it should be. And awe-inspiring.
Yeah.
So,
that's the word. The word is awe.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of people use the word awful. They use the word awesome very often, and they don't realize that the root we're talking about is that basically man attempting to capture the experience of the divine.
Yeah.
And occasionally you do it. And almost always it involves something that is primal, like you talked about. And it's something that people have always been able to experience. It's not because of lighting. It's because of a candle, something people have had for thousands of years. It's stones that were laid hundreds or thousands of years ago. It's things that predate our experience of the current world. And we tap into something that is really elemental when we do that. So I like the idea of a return to sacred spaces. I've been, I look around and I know, like, it or not it when I walk into a church right away.
Yeah.
And I feel the same way about politicians. It's like it or not it. Either you took those founding documents and felt the same way that I did, which is that somebody tapped into something elemental there that probably was above or beyond their capabilities. They were looking into a future that they could not see, and they also wrote something that affected the past as well. And it created something that didn't previously exist. And we live in that moment where it's on the cusp. Anyway, I get very philosophical when I sit and talk with you, my friend, because it is you remind me of the friends I used to sit and try to figure out what the world was about when my mind was still very wild and open as a teenager, and we do a lot of that story. So I appreciate you kind of joining me on that. Yeah. I want people to be able to also experience the fun, because it's really fun. You guys do a fun podcast on a Thursday still, and you're having these conversations, but you're also just messing with each other in a way that is smart people saying funny things that don't have to be smart. It just turns out to be sometimes accidentally, probably very meaningful. Yeah. Where do they go do that?
Yeah, well, for the time being, that's still on hiatus. I mean, as we've talked about, things have been rough here towards the end of my probationary term, much rougher than in the last 4 years as far as being able to generate revenue. So I had to kind of shelf the American Council for Truth and Journalism. I think people should go back and watch our election coverage if they've never seen it. I thought that was a particularly fun night, but they can find that on Twitter at the ACTJ. It's on Rumble as well, the American Council for Truth and Journalism. I'd like to get it going
that down
again.
In the notes.
I would like to get it going again, but that's like everything else in life, At some point, I'm just trying to make ends meet. I have one child still. I work with my adult son who's 19 years old. We kind of split duties and try to maintain a house for each other. Very blessed for that. Through all the things, as a single father, and just having my boys with me through thick and thin, that means the world to me. And so I'm just trying to pull my weight there. And and keep doing what I can in any capacity to make myself a better person. So, if that includes going back and getting to do the ACTJ again with all those boys I know and love, all those guys and gals that have really been my family through all this mess that you're now a part of, frankly, been a huge part of that, Kyle, then that's great if that's where God wants me. And I figure he'll make a path for that. If not, I'm okay with that too, So when people see the lights go off on my social media, or I just don't start posting anymore, then they know I got taken in a different direction and my time there was done. So, I don't know if that's where I'm at. It's funny, every time I think I'm there, just enough comes in, I always ask people to contribute to my work, because how else am I going to fund it at this point? And I've got some great ideas moving forward, so we'll see. We'll see if that pans out. If not, I know that there's a purpose for everything. And so, I'll just keep revealing what I saw so many years ago.
Yeah. It or it manifests in your life when you submit to it, which is it's really hard to do as a man. And
it's not fun. It's not fun. It really is submission. It's humility. It's all these things. I kind of mentioned that. I can sit here and I've done plenty of whining that kind of goes with the territory as a January 6th defendant, when you're like, oh, my life was destroyed. And in a lot of ways it was. I lost the house that I thought I was going to die in, lost a business, lost my wife. There's been a lot of loss. But I figure all that's for a purpose too. So I don't like getting too bogged down in it. I like to try to focus on the future. And again, I've been made humble. I was, I will always probably act like a wild man on TV, so to speak. Like it's just too much fun. It's a character that's been built up through the years. So you got to kind of maintain the character to a certain degree. But like anybody who knows me in my more private life and, my more reflective moments, I want to be a better person than what I've played on TV and the person that I've been in real life. So, I think that keeps things fun, and we'll see how it goes. So, I'm thankful for January 6th.
Not going to hear that very many places, folks. Except when you're listening to Nancy Pelosi chew on the chicken bone. She also is thankful. She's thankful for the vodkas that you leave out.
Clicking thing again, that was particularly good. You had that down. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, she does it she has a very specific way of making noises I don't want to hear with her face.
Oh, Nancy, an American treasure.
It's so bad. Shawn, thanks for taking it to an interesting place with me. Thanks for riding this train, which is always, I like that. Although you do play a wild man on TV, you come in and you bring a different depth. When people get a chance to actually look a little bit further or wait a little bit longer, they will find that there's a very serious character and a really, maybe my favorite introspective plumber. I don't know that many plumbers, but of the plumbers I know, you're my favorite, 100%. And I like that that's been it started with an interesting little conversation. I didn't even know anything about you the first time we spoke. And I feel immediate kinship with people that think far beyond, let's say, what people expect, or they punch way above the weight that people will look at them and immediately assess. That's my favorite kind of human being. And you're definitely one of those. So thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Kyle. It's always a pleasure. You're my favorite former Fed. Are we still doing COINTEL? I don't know.
It's hard to say. Well, we'll have to figure it out. Let's do it again, bud.
Yep, we'll do.
And that is our Sunday conversation. Thanks for joining. Thanks for listening in. If you guys are listening on another day, that's cool too. We really appreciate that. Make sure you're following us over on Rumble. It's rumble.com/Kyle Seraphin. You can find us on X @Kyle Seraphin. You can always find us on Locals. It's kyleseraphin.com. We're making this really complicated, aren't we? And lastly, you can find us on Spotify, iHeartRadio, or Apple Podcasts, wherever you want to go. If you want to catch the video, it is on Spotify. Share it around, give us a like, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and we'll see you again on Monday morning, 0930 Eastern Time. It's 8:30 Texas time. We do the Kyle Seraphin Show. If you guys want to just find us on the weekends, this is where you do it, and it starts at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning. Have a great week. God bless you. See you soon.
Thank you for listening to The Kyle Seraphin Show, streamed live weekdays on rumble.com/Kyle Seraphin. Follow Kyle on Twitter, Truth Social, and Instagram @Kyle Seraphin.